What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we would like to welcome everybody back to the channel for the beginning of our third season. We would also like to officially welcome our second full-time sponsor to the channel, the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. If you're ever in the central Illinois area, be sure to stop in and check out the store as well as saying hi to Martin. In this week's game, we have a fun commander matchup featuring Gavin playing Omnath, Locus of Creation, who is looking to play multiple lands a turn for ultimate Omnath value. Foil Making's returned to the channel playing Phenax, God of Deception, where he's looking to mill out all of his opponents with his big boat walls. Fallgirl playing Cecily Haunted Mage, where he's looking to load up his hand with cards before free casting big spells off his commander's attack trigger. And finally, Justin playing the Mimeoplasm, where he's looking to load up his graveyard in order to cast a giant unstoppable monstrosity. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Justin plays a Forest and passes. Gavin plays a tapped Hallowed Fountain and also passes. Foil plays a tapped Dismal Backwad for turn, gaining a life, before paying 2 life to target Justin with a Cataxian Probe. He then looks at Justin's hand before drawing a card. Fog plays an Evolving Wilds for turn before cracking to go get a tapped basic Swamp. Justin draws and plays a Law in Our Ways for turn before passing. Gavin plays a Windswept Heath for turn, paying to 1 life to crack it in order to go get a basic Forest. He then pays 2 to cast a Sylvan Library. Foil plays an untapped Dark Water Catacombs for turn before using it to cast a Wall of Ruins, scrying 1 when it enters play. He then uses his last floating mana and casts an Elixir of Immortality. Fog plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 in order to cast a Juicy Apprentice. Justin draws and plays another Forest for turn. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep because of his library and then decides to pay the 8 life to keep all 3. He then plays a Dark Depths return before paying 2 for a Farseek, going to get a tapped Stomping Grounds. Foil plays a Swamp for turn and pays 1 to cast Venture Deep to make Gavin mill 4 cards into his graveyard, while Justin casts a Harrow, sacking a Forest to go get 2 other lands. He then casts his Merfolk from his adventure and passes. Fog plays another Island for turn and pays 3 to draw a card using his Apprentice. Justin untaps, draws for turn, and then passes. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep, then puts 2 back. He then plays a Snow-Covered Forest before casting a Springbloom Druid, sacking a Forest to go get 2 more tapped lands. Foil plays an Island for turn, then pays 2 for a Wall of Lost Thoughts, having Fog mill 4 cards when it ETBs. Fog untaps and draws before playing a tapped Salundi Isle for turn. He then once again pays 3 to draw a card using his Apprentice. Justin plays another Swamp for turn that pays 5 to cast a Doom Whisperer. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep before paying 8 life to keep all 3. He then pays 4 to cast his commander Omnath, drawing a card, before playing a Bloodstained Mire, gaining 4 life. Gavin then pays 1 to crack his Mire, and in response, Justin pays 2 life to Surveil 2, putting both cards into his graveyard. Gavin then plays a Mountain, giving him extra Omnath mana, which he then uses to cast a Wayward Sawtooth. He then casts a Crucible of Worlds, which he uses to replay his Bloodstained Mire from his graveyard, shooting each of his opponents for 4 life. Foil plays another Island for turn before tapping out in order to cast his commander, Phenax. Fog draws for turn, then pays to use his Apprentice to draw a card. He then has 9 cards in hand and is able to flip his Apprentice into Tomoyo the Revealer. Fog then plays a Mountain for turn before paying 2 for a Ghostly Pilferer. Before his upkeep, Justin pays 2 life to surveil 2 cards into his graveyard, and then pays another 2 life to surveil again, putting them both into his graveyard. He then draws for turn before paying 3 for a Mystic Redaction. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep and puts 2 back. He then pays 6 to cast an Ancient Green Warden before playing a Command Tower, gaining 8 life. Gavin then pays 1 to cast a Mystic Remora before playing an Arid Mesa from his graveyard, gaining him 8 more mana. He then plays a Thrasios Triton Hero and pays a life to crack his Arid Mesa, going to get a Triumph, dealing 8 damage to each opponent. Justin then pays 2 life to surveil 1 card into his graveyard while he keeps the other one on top of his library. Gavin then draws a card, and before he passes turn, Foil taps his 3 walls to mill Gavin for 12 cards. Foil draws and then casts a Grisly Spectacle on Gavin's Green Warden, which has Gavin milling another 5 cards after his creature is destroyed. Fog draws for turn and then pays 4 to cast his commander, Cecily, before playing his Shivan Reef for turn. He then pays 2 for a Humbled Effector and passes. Justin draws and plays a Lord of Extinction before passing his turn. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep and puts 2 back. He then pays to cast a Greenstone Zenith for 8, and in response, foil mills him for 19 cards. Gavin then mills his cards and puts the plant Avenger of Zendikar from his library, creating 10 plant tokens when he ETBs. He then pays a life to crack a fetch in order to get a tapped Sacred Foundry, gaining 4 life and putting a +1/+1 counter on his plants. Gavin then puts 2 more lands to play, adding an additional 2 +1/+1 counters on his plants before casting a Felidar Retreat. He then goes to combat swinging his Swordtooth, Commander, and Druid all at foil for 10 damage. Foil draws for turn, then pays 1 to cast Ponder. He then looks at the top 3 cards of his library, then decides to put them back and shuffle his library before drawing a card. Foil then pays 3 to cast King Narfi's Betrayal to mill 4 cards from each of his opponent's libraries. Fog draws and taps his Humble Defector to draw 2 more cards before giving his Defector to Gavin. He then uses his Tomoyo to draw cards equal to the amount of cards he had in his hand before playing a Mountain as his land for turn. Fog then plays a Putrid Imp before discarding a card to give him flying. Fog then swings his Commander Foil, who blocks with a wall, while he draws a card and loses a life. He then gets to free cast Mnemonic Deluge from his hand, which he uses to target the Soulfire Eruption in his graveyard. Fog then gets 3 copies of Soulfire, which he uses to target each opponent and each of his opponent's creatures except for Gavin's plant tokens 3 times. Fog then exiles 45 cards from the top of his library, with each card dealing damage equal to their CMC to target player or creature in turn order. This then essentially deals enough damage to wipe the board of most of the creatures, while Justin loses 11 life and Foil loses 10. After exiling all of his cards, Fog gathers up all the cards that he exiled and sets them aside since he can play them until the end of his next turn. Fog then casts Reality Shift to exile Justin's Lord of Extinction, having him manifest the top card of his library. On his upkeep, Justin looks at the top card of his library and then scribes it to the bottom of his deck before drawing for turn. He then plays another Swamp before tapping out and casting Garuda, Doom of Depths, having each player mill the top 4 cards of their libraries. He then uses the Garuda ability to bring back his Sagu Mala from his own graveyard. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep, then puts 2 back. He then draws for turn before returning 2 lands back to play from his graveyard, which has him putting 2 +1/+1 counters on his Swordtooth. Gavin then recasts his commander and draws a card. He then casts a Trade Routes before going to combat, swinging his plants at Fog, taking him down to 1 life. On his end step, Foil mills Justin for 4 more cards. Foil plays an island for turn before paying to uptake his Saga, which he uses to cast Gavin's Dockside Extortionist, creating 5 treasure tokens when he ETBs. He then uses all his treasures and taps out to cast a Mind Grind where X is equal to 7. This then has each of his opponents milling cards in their graveyards until they each reveal 7 lands. Fog draws for turn, then plays a Swamp before paying 2 for his Triska Decaphile, and then the rest of his mana to cast a Maestro's Confluence, choosing the mode to go target player's creatures 3 times, targeting each of his opponents. Justin looks at the top card of his library before drawing it. He then plays a Command Tower before paying 5 to cast his commander, choosing to have him enter the battlefield as a copy of Stormtide Leviathan with an additional 7 +1/+1 counters. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep, then puts 2 back. He then casts Dryad of the Elysian Groves for 3 before playing 2 lands from his graveyard, gaining 4 life and casting a Marasa Rootgrazer. He then puts counters on his 2 creatures and passes, but before his instep, Foil mills him for 6 cards. Foil draws for turn and then plays a Murmuring Phantasm before also passing. After his untap step and before his draw step, Fog pays to draw a card, and in response, Foil uses his wall to mill Fog for 4 cards. In response to that, Fog pays to draw a second card before he ultimately gets milled out and dies on his upkeep. On his upkeep, Justin scribes the top card of his library to the bottom of his deck and then draws for turn. He then plays a Zagreath Triumph before casting a Growth Spiral to draw another card but can't play a second land. Justin then casts a Scavenging Ooze for turn before going to combat, swinging his commander at Gavin for 15 commander damage. Gavin draws 3 cards on his upkeep, then puts 2 back. He then plays a Flooded Strand for turn, followed by a Forest and an untapped Temple Garden, paying the 2 life. Gavin then puts more counters on his creatures and passes. On his instep, foil mills him for 2 more cards. Foil draws and taps out to cast Tyrellus Messenger, choosing Justin as the player to mill 5 cards when he enters. Justin draws return to place a Reflecting Pool before going to combat, swing his commander to foil, who in response taps all his available creatures in order to mill Justin for 11 cards. After this, he gets taken out of the game. Justin then pays to escape Pelucranos Unchained from his graveyard, which has him entering with an additional 12 +1/+1 counters. On his upkeep, Gavin looks at the top 3 cards of his library and then takes all 3, knowing the end is near, then decides to scoop the game up to Justin. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.